Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing in an ancient forge as the day draws to a close. The workshop is carved into the heart of a mountain, deep beneath the earth where volcanic fires burn eternal. Around you, the air still shimmers with residual heat, but the great forge fires are banking down now, glowing orange and red like a sunset captured in coals. The rhythmic clanging of hammer on anvil has ceased, replaced by the soft hiss and pop of cooling metal. Tools hang on the walls, hammers of every size, tongs that could grip anything from delicate wire to massive shields, anvils scarred by centuries of work. The floor is swept clean of metal shavings, everything put in its proper place with the care of a master craftsman. Bronze automatons, mechanical servants of gleaming gold, move silently through the space, banking the fires, organizing tools, preparing the workshop for tomorrow's labors. The warm glow illuminates intricate pieces in various stages of completion. Helmet here, a sword there, jewelry that catches the firelight and throws it back in rainbow colors. The volcanic mountain around you breathes with ancient power, but here in this workspace carved by divine hands, everything is ordered, purposeful, beautiful in its functionality. You can smell the forge smoke, the tang of hot metal, the mineral scent of volcanic rock. As you settle onto a bench worn smooth by use, you feel the satisfying exhaustion of a day's honest work, the deep contentment of creation. The fires dim further, and in their dying glow you understand something profound, that beauty is not always found in perfect forms, that genius can emerge from rejection, and that the most powerful revenge is simply becoming indispensable. Rest now and let us tell you the story of the god who turned ugliness into art, exile into mastery, and pain into the most magnificent creations the divine world has ever known. The ugly god, birth, rejection, and the first falls before we can understand the brilliance of Hephaestus, before we can appreciate his legendary creations and calculated revenges. We must begin with the trauma that defined him, his birth, his rejection, and his catastrophic fall from Olympus. This is not a story of divine perfection or heroic triumph. This is a story about being unwanted, about physical difference in a world obsessed with beauty, about a mother's cruelty and a child's enduring psychological wounds. But it's also a story about survival, about finding purpose in exile, about transforming rejection into power. The circumstances of Hephaestus' birth varied depending on which ancient source you consulted, but all versions shared certain elements. He was born different. He was rejected because of that difference, and he was literally thrown away like garbage by the very people who should have protected him. Some accounts claim that both Zeus and Hera were his parents, making him a legitimate child of the king and queen Olympus. But the most compelling and widely accepted version told a different story, one of spite, jealousy, and divine one-upmanship that would have profound consequences. According to this tradition, Hera conceived and bore Hephaestus through parthenogenesis, virgin birth without any male involvement, without Zeus. She did this deliberately, as an act of revenge and competition. Zeus had recently given birth to Athena entirely by himself. The goddess of wisdom had sprung fully formed from Zeus's skull after he swallowed her mother Metis. This miraculous birth without female participation had enraged Hera, who took it as an insult to her role as queen and as the goddess of marriage and childbirth itself. If Zeus could produce a child without her, then she would prove that she could produce a child without him. She would show that female creative power was equal to male, that she needed no husband to bring forth life. But when Hephaestus was born, Hera's triumph turned to horror. The child was not perfect. He was not the beautiful, flawless, divine infant she had expected. Ancient sources described him as having deformed or withered feet, legs that bent wrong, a twisted body, a face that didn't match the aesthetic standards of divine beauty. Some accounts said he was born lame, unable to walk properly. Others suggested his appearance was simply wrong in ways that offended Hera's sense of what an Olympian god should look like. The specifics varied, but the essential truth remained. In Hera's eyes, and by the standards of divine perfection that governed Olympus, her son was ugly, imperfect, unacceptable, the goddess who ruled over legitimate marriage and protected women in childbirth, who should have been the ultimate mother figure, looked at her newborn son and felt nothing but disgust and shame. She tried to prove her creative power equal to Zeus's, and she believed she had produced a monster, a defective product, a humiliation. The divine court would mock her. Zeus would feel vindicated. She had failed. And so, in a moment of cruelty that would echo through mythology for millennia, Hera made a decision that no mother should ever make. She took her infant son to the edge of Olympus, to the very precipice where the divine mountain met the sky, and she threw him off. She cast her newborn child down from heaven, hurling him into the void below, rejecting him absolutely and completely, disposing of him as one might dispose of any unwanted thing. Imagine that moment, a goddess, a mother, holding a helpless infant, a child she had born, looking at his face, finding him unworthy, and choosing to kill him by casting him from the heights of Olympus. The cruelty of it is almost incomprehensible, yet the ancient Greeks told this story without flinching, recognizing it as a truth about how appearance and perfection mattered more than life itself in their mythology. Hephaestus fell. For 9 days and 9 nights, he plummeted through the sky, a tiny divine infant tumbling through clouds and air, falling and falling and falling. Can you imagine the terror? Even a godchild falling for 9 days would experience that endless descent, that eternal falling, that journey from the only home he knew into nothing. The ancient sources don't tell us if he cried during that fall, if he screamed, if he understood what his mother had done to him. But we know he fell, helpless and rejected, cast out before he had even learned to walk. On the 9th day, Hephaestus crashed into the ocean. The impact should have killed him, would have killed him if he weren't divine, if immortality weren't woven into his very being. But gods don't die, not easily, and so Hephaestus survived the fall that his mother had intended to be his end. He survived, but he was broken, traumatized, an infant floating in the waves of a vast and uncaring sea, far from Olympus, far from any help, utterly alone. Then something miraculous happened. 2 sea goddesses swimming in those waters noticed something glinting in the foam. Thetis, a Nereid who would later become famous as the mother of Achilles, and Eurynome, an Oceanid, discovered the fallen infant god. They pulled him from the water, saw his injuries, his deformity, his helplessness, and where his mother had felt only disgust, these goddesses felt compassion. They took Hephaestus to their underwater grotto, a sea cave hidden beneath the waves, and there they raised him, nurtured him, protected him. For 9 years, Hephaestus grew up in this secret sanctuary, learning from the sea goddesses who had saved him, never knowing who had thrown him from Olympus or why, knowing only that he had been unwanted, rejected, cast away. In some versions of the story, the sea goddesses told Hephaestus nothing about his origins, allowing him to believe he was one of them, a child of the ocean. In other versions, they revealed the truth as he grew older, telling him that his mother had been ashamed of him, that Olympus had rejected him. Either way, Hephaestus grew up with the knowledge, explicit or implicit, that he was unwanted, different, unacceptable to the world of perfect gods above. But the trauma of rejection and exile had an unexpected consequence. Isolated in that underwater cave, surrounded by the beauty of the sea, Hephaestus discovered a talent, a gift, a purpose that would define his entire existence. He began to work with his hands. He took shells and stones and coral and began shaping them into beautiful objects. The sea goddesses were delighted, encouraging his creativity, providing him with materials, praising his growing skill. Hephaestus created jewelry for Thetis and Eurynome, pieces of such exquisite craftsmanship that they rivaled anything made on Olympus. He learned to work with metals that washed down from rivers into the sea, with precious materials that could be found in underwater caves. He taught himself smithing, metalworking, craftsmanship with an obsessive intensity that only a profoundly wounded child could muster. In his exile, in his rejection, Hephaestus was transforming his pain into purpose. He couldn't change his body, couldn't make himself beautiful, couldn't undo his mother's abandonment. But he could create beauty with his hands. He could make things that even the perfect gods of Olympus would admire. He could become indispensable through skill, even if he could never be admired for his appearance. Every piece he crafted, every hour spent at his makeshift forge, every improvement in his technique was an act of survival, of his self-creation, of turning trauma into power. The ancient sources tell us that even as a youth, Hephaestus's creations were magnificent beyond belief. He made moving statues, mechanical wonders, jewelry that seemed alive with captured light. The sea goddesses would show these pieces to other immortals who visited the ocean's depths, and word began to spread about the incredible craftsman living in Thetis's grotto. Who was this mysterious artisan producing work that rivaled the best smiths of the divine world? But there was another version of Hephaestus's fall, one told alongside the first, and ancient sources sometimes conflated the two, or presented them as separate incidents entirely. This second version portrayed a different kind of rejection, one that came not at birth but later, when Hephaestus had grown to adulthood and had already secured his place on Olympus. In this telling, Hephaestus was thrown from Olympus by Zeus himself, not by Hera, and the cause was familial conflict rather than shame over appearance. According to this version, Hera and Zeus were having one of their legendary quarrels, perhaps about Zeus's many infidelities, perhaps about his treatment of Heracles, or some other child born of his adultery. The fight escalated, and Zeus, in his rage, imprisoned Hera, suspending her between heaven and earth with golden chains. A humiliating and painful punishment for the Queen of Heaven. Hephaestus, seeing his mother in distress, attempted to intercede on her behalf, to free her, or at least pled for mercy. Zeus, furious at this interference, seized his son by the leg and hurled him from Olympus. This time, Hephaestus fell for an entire day, plummeting from morning until evening, until he crashed onto the island of Lemnos. The Scythian people who lived there found the fallen god, broken and battered from his impact. The spot where he landed was called the Lemnian Earth ever after, and it was said to have healing properties, consecrated by divine blood and suffering. The Scythians, simple but kind-hearted people, took Hephaestus in, cared for his injuries, and taught him their crafts. Under their instruction, he mastered smithing and metalworking, learning to harness volcanic fire to work with bronze and iron and gold. Some ancient sources tried to reconcile these two false stories, suggesting both happened. First, the infant rejection by Hera, then later the adult expulsion by Zeus. Others presented them as alternatives, different traditions explaining the same essential truth. Hephaestus was thrown from Olympus, literally cast out of heaven, rejected by his divine family because of disability, because of conflict, because he didn't fit the perfect mold of what an Olympian god should be. The psychological impact of this rejection, whether it happened in infancy or adulthood, whether from mother or father, cannot be overstated. Hephaestus carried this trauma throughout his mythology. He was the god who had been unwanted, the divine being who knew what it meant to be cast aside, the Olympian who remembered what it felt like to be considered unworthy. This shaped everything about him, his relationships with other gods, his marriages, his revenges, his obsessive work ethic, his need to prove his value through creation. But trauma also gave him something the other gods lacked: empathy, resilience, the ability to transform suffering into art. While Zeus and Ares and Apollo received worship for their power and beauty, Hephaestus would be honored by craftsmen, by workers, by people who survived through skill rather than strength, by anyone who had ever felt unworthy and fought to prove their value anyway. He was the patron god of the rejected, the imperfect, the wounded, and he would teach them that even broken things can create beauty, that even unwanted children can become indispensable, that revenge is best served not through violence but through becoming so skilled, so necessary, so brilliant, that those who rejected you must acknowledge your worth. The divine craftsman, master of fire and metal from his exile, whether in the ocean grotto with Thetis and Eurynomy, or on Lemnos with the Scythian people, Hephaestus emerged as something unprecedented in the divine world. He was not a warrior god like Ares, not a king like Zeus, not beautiful like Apollo or Aphrodite. He was a craftsman, a maker, an artisan, and his domain was not the battlefield or the sky or the sea, but the forge, that place where raw materials became artifacts through skill, heat, and vision. In a pantheon defined by natural forces and abstract concepts, Hephaestus represented human ingenuity, the transformative power of craft, the dignity of labor. His workshop on Mount Olympus became legendary. Unlike the palaces of other gods, adorned with meaningless opulence, Hephaestus's dwelling was functional, purposeful, every element designed for creation. Ancient sources described it in vivid detail. A massive forge at the center, an anvil that had shaped more divine artifacts than any other object in existence, 20 bronze bellows that worked automatically at his command, breathing life into fires that could melt any metal known to gods or mortals. The walls were lined with tools, hammers ranging from delicate jeweler's tools to massive sledgehammers that could forge shields for giants, tongs of every configuration, chisels and files and rasps, measuring instruments of divine precision. But the most remarkable elements of Hephaestus's workshop were his assistants. Unable or unwilling to rely on other gods for help, he had created his own servants, golden handmaidens, automata crafted from precious metal, animated through some divine art that ancient sources could barely describe. Homer tells us these golden women had understanding in their hearts, and speech and strength, that they moved and thought and assisted Hephaestus in his work, supporting him when his disabled legs grew weary, fetching tools, maintaining the forge. They were, in essence, artificial intelligence crafted in antiquity, the ancient world's dream of self-moving machines made manifest. He also crafted self-moving tripods with golden wheels, designed to roll themselves into the assembly halls of the gods, serving wine and ambrosia without need for divine servants. These autonomous creations amazed the Olympians, who had never seen anything like them. Objects that moved by themselves, that served purposes without constant divine attention, that demonstrated that careful planning and engineering could produce effects that seemed like magic. Hephaestus's workshop was not just a place of production, it was a laboratory of innovation, a place where the boundaries between the possible and impossible blurred under the gods' skilled hands. But Hephaestus had other workshops beyond Olympus. The ancient Greeks believed he maintained forges in volcanic regions, places where the earth itself breathed fire and smoke. The island of Lemnos, where he had recovered from his fall in some versions, was sacred to him, and its volcanic activity was attributed to his underground forge. Mount Etna in Sicily was said to be his primary earthly workshop, its eruptions the smoke from his fires, its earthquakes the pounding of his hammer. The Lipari Islands, volcanic archipelago north of Sicily, were also claimed as his domain. Anywhere the earth split open and fire emerged, Hephaestus was believed to be working, assisted by the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants who had forged Zeus's thunderbolts and now labored in the god's service. The Cyclopes, Brontes, Thunder, Steropes, Lightning, and Pyracmon, Anvil, were Hephaestus's sometimes collaborators, master smiths in their own right who recognized his supreme skill. Together they crafted weapons and tools that defied mortal comprehension, objects imbued with divine power, items that could turn the tide of wars or change the nature of reality itself. The list of Hephaestus's creations reads like a catalog of Greek mythology's most important artifacts. For Zeus, he forged the thunderbolts. Not all of them, for the original bolts had been made by the Cyclopes during the Titanomachy, but he maintained them, repaired them, created new ones when needed. These weapons could shatter mountains, burn cities, enforce the will of Aphrodite, the king of gods. They were raw power made physical, packaged in forms that Zeus could hurl at his enemies. For Athena, he created the Aegis, that terrible breastplate or shield, decorated with the head of Medusa, fringed with serpents, which could freeze enemies with terror. When Athena shook the Aegis in battle, armies would break and run. Hephaestus had woven protection and fear into a single object, proving that defense could be as terrible as offense. For Hermes, he crafted the winged sandals and helmet that allowed the messenger god to fly swiftly between the mortal and divine worlds, and the caduceus, a staff entwined with serpents that became the symbol of heralds and, later, of medicine. These tools of communication and transit enabled Hermes to fulfill his divine role, showing how Hephaestus's creations didn't just demonstrate skill but enabled other gods to be who they needed to be. For Apollo and Artemis, he forged silver arrows that never missed their marks, weapons worthy of the greatest archers among the gods. For Demeter, he created the golden sickle with which grain could be harvested without tarnish or rust. For Dionysus, he made vessels that would keep wine perfectly aged and flavorful for eternity. Every god had received something from his forge. Every Olympian was in some way dependent on his skill. But Hephaestus's greatest creations were perhaps those made for heroes and mortals who had earned divine favor. The armor of Achilles stands as his masterwork, described in extraordinary detail by Homer in the Iliad. When Achilles' original armor was captured by Hector, Achilles' mother Thetis, the very sea goddess who had rescued Hephaestus as an infant, came to the smith god to beg for new armor for her son. Hephaestus, remembering her kindness, agreed immediately and crafted armor so magnificent that it became the subject of ekphrasis, one of the longest and most beautiful descriptive passages in ancient literature. The shield alone was a cosmic wonder. On its surface, Hephaestus depicted the entire world: earth, sea, sky, the sun, the moon, the stars. He showed cities at peace and cities at war, farmers at harvest and shepherds with their flocks, dancers at festivals, and judges at legal proceedings. He captured the cycle of agricultural seasons, the processes of plowing and planting and reaping. He showed the ocean stream that encircles all lands, running around the shield's outer rim. It was not merely a protective object, but a philosophical statement, a cosmological diagram, a work of art that contained the entirety of human and divine experience. Warriors who saw Achilles wearing this armor said it seemed alive, that the scenes on the shield appeared to move, that looking at it was like seeing the whole world in miniature. The helmet blazed with celestial fire, plumes of horsehair seeming to burn without consuming. The greaves fit perfectly to Achilles' legs. The corselet covered his torso with bronze, scales that overlapped like a dragon's hide. Protective, yet flexible, beautiful, yet functional. Ancient sources claimed that when Achilles donned this armor, he became virtually unstoppable, not through the armor's protective properties alone, but through the confidence it inspired, the way it made him feel like a god, made manifest in the mortal world. Hephaestus also crafted armor for Heracles, including the golden breastplate that protected the hero during his 12 labors. He made the bronze clappers that Heracles used to scare away the Stymphalian birds, showing that even seemingly simple tools could be divine creations when made with purpose and skill. For Diomedes, he forged a corselet. For Memnon, son of Eos, he created armor at his mother's request. For Aeneas, he made equipment that would protect the Trojan hero through his journey to Italy and the founding of Rome's progenitor civilization. But Hephaestus's genius extended beyond weapons and armor. He created jewelry of incomparable beauty: necklaces, crowns, girdles, rings. Most famous was the girdle of Aphrodite, a belt or sash woven with such magic that it made anyone who wore it irresistibly attractive, kindling desire in all who saw them. Hephaestus made this for his wife, Aphrodite, a gift that simultaneously demonstrated his love for her and his understanding that her beauty was her power, that he could create objects that enhanced what she already possessed. The girdle's creation was simultaneously a gift, an acknowledgement of their relationship's inequality, and perhaps a subtle comment on the nature of beauty itself, that even divine beauty could be augmented, that attraction could be manufactured, that appearance was a construct that skill could manipulate. He built palaces for the gods, designing and constructing their divine dwellings with engineering precision. The bronze gates that opened and closed automatically at Olympus, Hephaestus's work. The golden floor that never tarnished, his design. The countless tripods, tables, cups, and household items that made divine life comfortable and beautiful, all products of his forge. One of his most philosophically significant creations was Pandora, the first woman according to Hesiod's telling, when Prometheus stole fire from heaven to give to humanity. Zeus plotted revenge not just on the Titan, but on all mankind. He commanded Hephaestus to create a woman from clay and water, to craft a being of such beauty and apparent innocence that men would welcome her, not suspecting the doom she carried. Hephaestus molded her body, gave her human form and voice, crafted her features with the same care he gave to divine artifacts. Then other gods added their gifts. Athena taught her weaving and domestic arts. Aphrodite gave her grace and desire. Hermes gave her cunning and deceit. But it was Hephaestus who created the basic structure, who brought clay to life, who demonstrated that his craft could produce not just objects, but beings. Pandora was sent to Earth with her famous jar, often mistranslated as a box, which she would open to release all the evils that now plague humanity. Disease, death, toil, suffering. Only hope remained trapped inside when she managed to close the lid. Pandora represents one of the darker aspects of Hephaestus's power. That creation is morally neutral. That skill can be used for punishment as easily as blessing. That the craftsman's hands can build destruction as readily as beauty. Hephaestus never questioned Zeus's command to try to create Pandora, never objected to crafting an instrument of divine revenge against humanity. He simply did what he did best. He created a masterpiece, regardless of its intended purpose. Another creation that speaks to both his genius and his willingness to serve revenge was the adamantine chains that bound Prometheus to the Caucasus Mountains. When Zeus punished the Titan for stealing fire, it was Hephaestus who forged the unbreakable bonds. Hephaestus who traveled to that desolate mountain. Hephaestus who drove the chains through Prometheus's flesh and into the living rock. Some versions say he did this reluctantly, sympathizing with Prometheus's theft, since fire was Hephaestus's own domain. But sympathy didn't stop him from completing the task with his usual precision, ensuring Prometheus would remain bound until Zeus chose to free him. The mechanical marvels Hephaestus created went beyond human or divine comprehension. He made Talos, the bronze giant who guarded Crete, walking around the island 3 times daily to prevent invasions. Talos had a single vein running from his neck to his ankle plugged with a bronze nail. If the nail were removed, Talos's ichor, divine blood equivalent, would drain out and the giant would die. But protected by this mechanism, Talos was nearly invincible. A robot guard millennia before the concept existed. He crafted the golden dogs that guarded the palace of Alcinous eternally, vigilant, never aging, never sleeping, never needing food or water. Perpetual motion and perpetual awareness captured in metal form. He made self-moving tables for the gods' feasts. vehicles that rolled where commanded, objects that defied every law of physics mortals understood. Hephaestus represented something revolutionary in Greek religion, the deification of labor and skill. Other gods embodied forces, storm, sea, love, war. But Hephaestus embodied craft, the transformation of materials through intelligent design and patient work. He was the god who taught humanity metalworking, who revealed the secret of the forge, who showed that fire could be controlled and directed rather than simply feared. He represented the possibility that intelligence and skill could rival raw power, that patient labor could achieve what brute strength could not, that beauty could be created as well as simply possessed. In his workshop, covered in soot, sweating from the forge's heat, limping between anvil and fire, Hephaestus demonstrated a truth the other beautiful gods never had to learn. That worth must be earned, that value comes from what you create rather than how you appear, that the hands that build things matter more than the face that launches ships. He was ugly and he was brilliant, broken and indispensable, rejected and essential. He had transformed his trauma into mastery, his exile into purpose, his pain into the most magnificent creations the cosmos had ever known. And that transformation would become the foundation for his greatest revenges. Not violent, not immediate, but calculated, patient, inevitable revenges crafted with the same skill he brought to every work. Because Hephaestus understood something fundamental about power. The person who makes the tools everyone needs is never truly powerless, no matter how much they might be mocked or rejected. He would prove this truth first to his mother, and the proof would be absolute. The Golden Throne, revenge on his mother. Hephaestus grew in skill during his exile, whether in the ocean grotto or on Lemnos, crafting marvels that attracted attention even in his isolation. Word reached Olympus about the magnificent creations being produced by this extraneous and mysterious artisan, jewelry that rivaled the work of gods, mechanical wonders that moved by themselves, pieces of such exquisite beauty that even immortals coveted them. Eventually, inevitably, someone on Olympus connected the stories of this brilliant craftsman with the son Hera had thrown away, the infant she had cast from heaven in shame and disgust. Hephaestus knew who he was. The sea goddesses, or the Sintians, had told him the truth about his origins, about his mother's rejection, about the divine family that had disposed of him because his appearance wasn't acceptable. He knew he had a mother on Olympus, a mother who had looked at her newborn son and found him so repulsive that she had chosen infanticide over the embarrassment of raising an imperfect child. That knowledge burned in him, a rage that never quite cooled, even as he worked his forge and created beauty from base metal. But Hephaestus's revenge would not be simple violence or direct confrontation. He was not Ares, who solved problems by stabbing them. He was not Zeus, who could hurl thunderbolts at his enemies. He was a craftsman, and his revenge would be a masterwork, calculated, patient, inevitable, and impossible to escape without acknowledging the person she had tried to destroy. He would use his greatest skill against the person who had rejected him for lacking other qualities. He would turn his craft itself into a weapon, creating a trap so elegant that even the Queen of Heaven couldn't resist it. Hephaestus designed and built a throne unlike any other in creation. It was magnificent beyond description, a piece of furniture that transcended function to become art. The throne was constructed of pure gold, polished to a mirror sheen, adorned with jewels that caught light and fractured it into rainbows. The arms curved in perfect ergonomic comfort. The back rose in a curve that promised absolute support. The seat was cushioned with material softer than clouds. Intricate scenes were carved and inlaid across its surface. Images of gardens and palaces, of divine celebrations, of Hera herself in all her queenly glory. The craftsmanship was flawless, every joint invisible, every decoration balanced and beautiful. It was exactly the sort of throne that the vain Queen of Heaven would find irresistible, a seat worthy of her status, an object that proclaimed the sitter's importance. But hidden within that beautiful exterior was a mechanism of diabolical ingenuity. Invisible catches, secret springs, hidden chains woven through the throne structure, all designed to activate the moment someone sat down. The throne was a trap, and the trap was invisible, undetectable, unavoidable once triggered. Hephaestus had designed it with one victim in mind, had calculated every detail to ensure it would work perfectly, had built in safeguards so that no one else could free the person caught in it. He had created beauty that concealed violence, art that was simultaneously a weapon, a gift that was a curse. When the throne was complete, Hephaestus arranged for it to be delivered to Olympus. In some versions, he sent it directly as a gift to his mother, perhaps with a note expressing filial devotion, perhaps without any explanation at all. In other versions, he sent it as a general gift to Olympus, knowing that Hera would claim it as her own, would see its magnificence and declare that only the Queen of Heaven deserved to sit upon such a throne. Either way, the throne arrived at Olympus, and it was beautiful, and Hera saw it and wanted it immediately. The Queen of Gods approached the golden throne with delight. Finally, a piece of furniture worthy of her status, beautiful enough to match her beauty, expensive enough to reflect her importance. She sat down, feeling the comfortable cushions, admiring how the throne seemed made for her body, how it elevated her above everyone else in the divine court. And the moment her full weight settled onto that seat, the trap activated. Invisible chains whipped out from the throne structure, wrapping around Hera's wrists, arms, ankles, waist. The throne's mechanisms locked with a sound like breaking bones. Springs and catches engaged, pulling Hera tight against the seat, binding her arms to the arms of the throne, locking her legs in place, rendering her completely immobile. She couldn't stand, couldn't shift position, couldn't even lean forward. She was held in a sitting position by chains she couldn't see, trapped by invisible bonds, imprisoned by the throne she had been so eager to claim. Hera screamed. She called for help. She demanded release. She tried to use her divine power to break free, but the chains were unbreakable, forged by a smith god who knew exactly how strong they needed to be to hold an Olympian. She was caught, suspended in midair on this throne that would not let her stand, trapped in a sitting position that became increasingly painful as hours passed, and she couldn't move, couldn't adjust, couldn't escape. The other gods tried to help. They examined the throne, looking for mechanisms, searching for ways to release Hera, but Hephaestus had designed it too well. The catches were hidden, the mechanisms invisible, the structure so cunningly crafted that even Athena's wisdom couldn't unravel it. They tried to break the throne, but it was too strong. Gold reinforced with divine metallurgy, unbreakable by any force the Olympians could bring to bear. They tried cutting the chains, but the chains couldn't be severed, couldn't be loosened, couldn't be affected by any tool or spell. Hours turned into days. Hera remained trapped, growing increasingly uncomfortable, furious, desperate. The Queen of Heaven was imprisoned on a golden throne in the middle of Olympus, unable to perform her duties, unable to eat or drink properly, unable to move. It was humiliating beyond measure, a public display of powerlessness for the goddess who prided herself on control and dignity. Every god and goddess who walked past could see her trapped, could witness her helplessness, could recognize that someone had managed to capture the Queen of Heaven in a trap she couldn't escape. Finally, the gods summoned Hephaestus. They sent messages to wherever he was working, in his ocean grotto or on Lemnos, asking him to come to Olympus to free Hera from this trap. But Hephaestus refused. He wouldn't come. He wouldn't help. Why should he? Some versions tell us his response was brief and brutal. I have no mother. Those 3 words carried enormous weight. I have no mother. Not, I won't help her, or she doesn't deserve my assistance, but I have no mother. He was denying Hera's relationship to him entirely, declaring that the woman who had thrown him from Olympus had forfeited all maternal rights, all claims to his filial duty, if she could reject him utterly when he was an infant, helpless and in need, then he could reject her now when she was trapped and in need. If she could say he wasn't good enough to be her son, he could say she had never been his mother at all. The gods begged. They offered gifts, honors, privileges, but Hephaestus refused them all. He had one demand, never explicitly stated, but implicitly clear. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted Olympus to recognize that they needed him, that the son Hera had thrown away was now the only person who could save her, that the god they had exiled was the only one clever enough, skilled enough, powerful enough to undo the trap. He wanted Hera specifically to understand what she had thrown away, to feel the absence of the child she had rejected, to know that her suffering could end at any moment. If only the person she had tried to destroy chose to be merciful. Days stretched into weeks. Hera's needs grew more urgent. She required food, water, rest, all of which were difficult or impossible while trapped. Her power was needed for various divine functions, and the cosmos itself began to suffer from her absence. Zeus grew desperate. The king of gods couldn't allow his queen to remain trapped indefinitely, couldn't permit his rule to be undermined by one god's stubborn refusal to help. Zeus sent Ares first, ordering the war god to bring Hephaestus to Olympus by force if necessary. Ares, who valued strength above all, who had likely mocked Hephaestus's appearance and disability in the past, went confidently to confront the craftsman god. But Hephaestus met Ares with weapons, torches of burning metal, tools heated to searing temperatures, threats to fight rather than submit. Ares, god of war though he was, couldn't force Hephaestus to return, couldn't overpower a god in his own forge, surrounded by fire and tools that could become weapons in skilled hands. Ares retreated, defeated, humiliated that he couldn't complete this simple task. Then Zeus tried a different approach. He sent Dionysus, god of wine, who had always been friendly with Hephaestus, who understood that persuasion often worked better than force. Dionysus came to Hephaestus's forge, not with threats, but with wine, with friendship, with understanding. He sat with Hephaestus and talked. He listened to the craftsman god's pain, his rage at his mother's rejection, his demand for acknowledgement. Dionysus didn't argue or judge. He simply shared wine and companionship with a god who had experienced too little of either. As the wine flowed, as Dionysus showed genuine kindness and respect, Hephaestus began to soften. This wasn't about forcing him to submit or bribing him to comply. This was about one god recognizing another god's worth, offering friendship without conditions, accepting Hephaestus exactly as he was, lame, ugly, hurt, angry, and brilliant, all at once. Slowly, gradually, Hephaestus grew intoxicated on wine and acceptance in equal measure. When Dionysus suggested they return to Olympus together, when he offered to support Hephaestus's claims for recognition and status, Hephaestus agreed. Ancient artwork depicts this scene beautifully. Dionysus leading Hephaestus back to Olympus, the craftsman god drunk and riding on a donkey, the humble animal that would become his symbol, surrounded by satyrs and maenads in celebration, the procession simultaneously comic and triumphant. Hephaestus was returning to Olympus not in shame or submission, but in triumph, accompanied by a god who treated him as an equal, riding in parody of military processions, claiming his place among the Olympians not through birth or beauty, but through demonstrated necessity. When Hephaestus arrived at Olympus, he made his terms clear. Zeus, desperate to free Hera and restore order, agreed to give Hephaestus anything he wanted. The craftsman god demanded recognition as a full Olympian, a palace and workshop on the divine mountain, acknowledgement of his skill and importance. Some sources say he also demanded a wife, specifically that he be married to Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty herself, perhaps as the ultimate reversal of his rejection for ugliness. Zeus agreed to everything. The price of Hera's freedom was Hephaestus's permanent elevation from exile to honored place among the gods. Only then did Hephaestus approach the golden throne. He moved with his characteristic limp, carrying his tools, and began to work. With practiced efficiency, he found the hidden catches, released the secret mechanisms, unwound the invisible chains. Within moments, Hera was free, able to stand and move after weeks of imprisonment. The Queen of Heaven looked at her son, the child she had thrown away, who had just demonstrated conclusively that he was more powerful, more necessary, more valuable than his appearance suggested. The ancient sources don't record what Hera said to Hephaestus in that moment. If she apologized, if she acknowledged what she had done to him as an infant, if she felt any guilt or remorse. Perhaps she thanked him coldly and walked away. Perhaps she said nothing at all. Perhaps she still saw him as ugly and imperfect, still wished he looked different, still resented needing his help. But it didn't matter. Hephaestus had achieved what he needed. Olympus had acknowledged his worth. Zeus had granted him permanent status and a place on the divine mountain, and Hera had been forced to sit in helpless imprisonment until her rejected son chose to show mercy. The Golden Throne became legendary, a story told throughout Greek mythology about the craftsman god's first great revenge. It demonstrated the core truth of Hephaestus's power, that brains triumph over beauty, that skill defeats strength, that the maker of tools controls those who need them. He hadn't struck Hera with thunderbolts or conquered her in battle. He had simply created something she wanted, let her take it, and then demonstrated that Only he could undo what he had made. It was elegant, inevitable, and absolutely characteristic of a god whose greatest weapon had always been his mind. And now Hephaestus had a permanent place on Olympus, a workshop where he would create ever more magnificent objects, and soon, if Zeus kept his promise, a wife of legendary beauty, who represented everything his mother had once claimed he could never have. The forge fires of Olympus burned bright, and the lame god stood at their center, finally home, finally recognized, finally exactly where he had always deserved to be. The lame god's place. Among the perfect, Hephaestus's return to Olympus should have been a triumph without qualification, a victorious homecoming for a god who had proven his worth beyond any doubt. He had forced the recognition he deserved, secured his place among the 12 Olympians, established his workshop at the heart of divine power, but living on Olympus as the one imperfect god among paragons of physical perfection brought its own challenges, its own humiliations, its own constant reminders that he would never truly fit the aesthetic ideal his fellow deities embodied. The ancient Greeks were obsessed with physical beauty, with the perfect form of the human body idealized and made divine. Their gods were kaloi kagathoi, beautiful and good, with the two concepts inseparably intertwined in Greek thought. Beauty indicated virtue. Perfection of form suggested perfection of spirit. Physical excellence reflected moral excellence. The temples, statues, and vase paintings that depicted the gods showed them as athletic, symmetrical, radiantly beautiful beings without flaw or blemish. Except for Hephaestus, ancient sources describe his appearance in terms that emphasize his difference from the other gods. He was lame, walking with a pronounced limp that required him to use a walking stick for support. His feet or legs were deformed. Some accounts said he had club feet that turned backwards. Others described withered legs. Still others suggested a twisted spine that affected his gait. His body was short and stocky from years of forge work. His shoulders broad and muscular but hunched. His hands powerful but scarred and calloused. His face was described as rough, bearded heavily, marked by soot and smoke from the forge, where Apollo was radiant, where Ares was handsome, where even Zeus maintained an aura of regal beauty. Hephaestus was, by divine standards, ugly. Homer describes a scene in the Iliad that captures the dynamic perfectly. The gods are gathered for a feast on Olympus, and Hephaestus, acting as cupbearer, serves nectar to the assembled deities. He hobbles from god to god, limping heavily, carrying the precious cup, moving as quickly as his damaged legs will allow. And as he serves them, as he passes among these beautiful, perfect beings, they laugh. The gods of Olympus laugh at Hephaestus, at his limp, at the contrast between his ungainly movement and their graceful repose, at the ridiculous sight of the crippled god trying to serve them efficiently despite his disability. Homer tells us an unquenchable laughter arose among the blessed gods as they saw Hephaestus puffing through the palace. It's played for comedy, this scene of divine mirth at the lame god's expense. The laughter isn't cruel, or at least, it's not framed as cruel in the text, but it's certainly mockery, certainly an acknowledgement that Hephaestus doesn't belong, doesn't match, doesn't fit the aesthetic of Olympian perfection. Hephaestus, ancient sources tell us, didn't respond to this mockery with rage or hurt. He kept serving nectar, kept moving through the hall, kept fulfilling his function. Perhaps he had learned long ago that protesting only made things worse, that the best response to being laughed at was to ignore it and continue working. Perhaps his exterior calm masked interior pain. Perhaps he genuinely didn't care what the other gods thought of his appearance, secure enough in his skill to let their laughter roll off him like water. Or perhaps, most likely, he simply understood the reality of his situation. He could be the best craftsman in the cosmos, could create wonders beyond their imagining, but he would still be the ugly god, the lame god, the one who didn't look like he belonged. But Hephaestus's disability and appearance created an interesting paradox in his status on Olympus. He was simultaneously mocked and essential, ridiculed and indispensable, seen as lesser and desperately needed. Every god who laughed at his limp wore armor he had forged, carried weapons he had created, lived in palaces he had designed. Zeus's power came from thunderbolts Hephaestus maintained. Athena's authority was reinforced by the aegis he had crafted. Ares's effectiveness in battle depended on weapons from Hephaestus's forge. They could mock him, but they couldn't function without him. That was Hephaestus's power and his revenge. Not loud or dramatic, but constant and absolute. The beautiful gods needed the ugly god. The perfect gods needed the defective god. The powerful gods needed the crippled god. He had made himself indispensable through skill, had transformed his exile into the foundation for a monopoly on craftsmanship that even the Olympians couldn't break. His workshop on Olympus reflected his complicated status. It was magnificent. How could it not be, built by the greatest craftsman in existence? But it was also explicitly separate from the beautiful, ornate palaces of other gods, where their homes were designed for display, for entertaining, for showcasing status. Hephaestus's workshop was designed for function. The forge fires burned at its center. The tools were within easy reach. The space was organized for efficient work rather than aesthetic impression. He lived where he worked, or worked where he lived, and the boundary between the two was meaningless for a god whose entire existence revolved around creation. His relationship with the other Olympians varied god to god. With Athena, he shared a connection through craft. She was goddess of weaving and other domestic arts, of strategic thinking and intelligent warfare, of wisdom embodied in creating useful things. They had worshippers in common, especially in Athens, where craftsmen and artisans honored both deities. Athena respected Hephaestus's skill, even if she didn't find him attractive, recognized him as an equal in intelligence, if not in beauty. They collaborated on projects, shared techniques, maintained a professional relationship that occasionally suggested something warmer, though Athena's adamant virginity would prevent any romantic connection. With Ares, the relationship was hostile, full of mutual contempt. Ares represented brute strength, violence, the chaos of war, everything that could be solved by hitting it hard enough. Hephaestus represented intelligence, planning, the craftsmanship that made better weapons, which made Ares's battles possible. Ares was beautiful and stupid. Hephaestus was ugly and brilliant. They were opposites, and neither understood or valued what the other represented. Ares mocked Hephaestus openly, called him lame and weak, laughed at his limp and his appearance. Hephaestus responded by noting that physical strength was useless without weapons, that even Ares depended on equipment that came from his forge, that the war god was essentially a craftsman's tool, shaped and directed by those smarter than himself. This antagonism would become critically important later when Aphrodite chose Ares as her lover, when the beautiful goddess preferred the handsome war god over her ugly husband, when Hephaestus had to confront the reality that his wife was cheating on him with his rival. But even before that crisis, Ares and Hephaestus represented competing visions of masculine power, one based on physical strength and violent dominance, one based on intelligence and creative skill. With Zeus, Hephaestus maintained a complex relationship. Zeus was his father in most versions, the god who had either thrown him from Olympus for intervening in a marital dispute, or who had allowed Hera to throw him for being born deformed, or who had brokered the deal that brought him back. Zeus needed Hephaestus, needed his thunderbolts maintained, needed his craftsmanship for various divine projects. But he also occasionally expressed impatience with the god whose disability made him less impressive than other Olympians. Zeus was power incarnate, and Hephaestus represented the uncomfortable truth that power often came from tools and technology, rather than from inherent divinity. Despite the mockery, despite the awareness that he didn't fit Olympus's aesthetic standards, Hephaestus carved out a crucial role for himself. He became patron god of all craftsmen, blacksmiths, metalworkers, sculptors, artisans, anyone who made things with skilled hands. His worship was especially strong in Athens, the great center of Greek craft and manufacture, where the Temple of Hephaestus still stands today, one of the best preserved ancient Greek temples. Workers in bronze, iron, gold, and silver all honored him. Potters called on him. Stonemasons recognized him as their divine patron. He represented something radical in Greek religion: the dignity of labor, the value of skill over beauty, the idea that worth came from what you created rather than how you looked. In a culture that often denigrated manual labor as beneath aristocratic dignity, Hephaestus stood as proof that working with your hands could be divine, that craftsmanship was a sacred calling, that intelligence expressed through material creation was as important as strength or beauty. His festivals celebrated those values. The Chalcea, held in Athens in October, honored both Hephaestus and Athena as gods of craft. Workers in various trades would make sacrifices, display their finest work, compete in demonstrations of skill. The Hephaestia, celebrated especially on Lemnos, involved torch races and sacrifices, commemorating the god's association with fire and his rescue by the island's people. These weren't grand festivals like Zeus's Olympian Games or Dionysus's theatrical celebrations, but they were important to the people who actually made things, who built Greek civilization through their skilled labor. Hephaestus also served a psychological and social function in Greek mythology. He was the god who showed that imperfection could be overcome, that disability didn't preclude achievement, that someone rejected for their appearance could still become essential. Parents of disabled children could point to Hephaestus and say, the gods themselves include someone who is different, someone who faces challenges, someone who succeeds through intelligence and skill rather than physical perfection. Craftsmen who felt looked down upon by the aristocracy could find dignity in worshiping a god who understood labor, who valued creation, who proved that the hands that make things are divine. But living on Olympus also meant Hephaestus was constantly confronted with what he wasn't and could never be. He saw Ares' handsome face and athletic body. He saw Apollo's radiant beauty and graceful movement. He saw Hermes' effortless charm, and he knew that no amount of skill, no accumulation of magnificent creations, no degree of indispensability would ever make him beautiful by divine standards. He could forge the most perfect helmet in existence, but he would still hobble through Olympus on damaged legs while gods laughed. He could create jewels that made their wearer irresistibly attractive, but he would still have the rough, soot-marked face of someone who spent too much time at the forge. This tension between his essential role and his permanent status as other defined Hephaestus' existence on Olympus. He was simultaneously central and marginal, valued and mocked, powerful and pitied. He had everything a god could want: immortality, a place among the Olympians, a workshop where he could pursue his craft, recognition of his genius. Except for the one thing Greek culture told him mattered most: beauty, physical perfection, the kind of divine appearance that inspired worship and desire rather than respect, tinged with pity. And then Zeus granted him the ultimate prize, the marriage that was supposed to prove he had finally achieved everything, the wife who would supposedly balance his ugliness with her beauty and validate his place among the perfect gods. Zeus gave him Aphrodite, and that gift would become the source of Hephaestus' greatest pain and his most famous revenge. Aphrodite, the beautiful wife, the painful marriage. The marriage of Hephaestus and Aphrodite stands as one of the most psychologically complex relationships in Greek mythology, a union of opposites so extreme that it seems designed to fail, pairing the ugliest god with the most beautiful goddess, the god of labor with the goddess of pleasure, the master of function with the embodiment of aesthetic perfection. How this marriage came about, why it existed, and what it meant for both parties reveals much about power, beauty, desire, and the cruelty of divine politics. Ancient sources disagree about why Zeus arranged this unlikely marriage. In some versions, it was part of the price for freeing Hera from the Golden Throne. Hephaestus demanded Aphrodite as his wife, and Zeus, desperate to restore his queen, agreed. In other accounts, the marriage was purely Hera's idea, a punishment for Aphrodite, perhaps in revenge for some real or imagined slight, binding the goddess of love to the god she found least attractive. Some sources suggest Zeus arranged it to prevent conflict among the gods. So many male deities desired Aphrodite that giving her to one of the conventionally handsome gods would provoke jealousy and competition, but giving her to Hephaestus, whom no one envied, solved the problem neatly. Whatever the reason, the marriage was arranged without consulting either party's feelings. This was normal in ancient Greek culture, where marriages were primarily political and economic arrangements between families, rather than romantic partnerships. But even by those standards, pairing Hephaestus and Aphrodite seemed cruel, almost deliberately designed to make both parties miserable. Aphrodite was beauty incarnate, born from the sea foam when Cronus threw Uranus's severed genitals into the ocean. She embodied physical perfection, sexual desire, the power of attraction itself. Everything about her was aesthetically ideal. Her face, her body, her movement, her voice, her presence. She was the goddess men desired and women envied, the living embodiment of the Greek obsession with physical beauty. Her very existence was about appearance, attraction, the power that comes from being universally desired. Hephaestus was her opposite in every way. Where she was beautiful, he was ugly. Where she was graceful, he limped. Where she inspired desire, he inspired respect tinged with pity. Where her power came from, how she appeared, his power came from what he created. They had nothing in common, no shared interests, no basis for affection, no reason to want this marriage beyond Zeus's command. The wedding presumably happened, though ancient sources don't describe it in detail. Imagine that ceremony, the most beautiful goddess in existence, standing beside the lame, rough-smith god, bound together in marriage before all Olympus. Did Aphrodite cry? Did Hephaestus feel any hope that this could work? Did the gathered gods whisper about the mismatch, about how strange it was to see beauty married to ugliness, grace to awkwardness, desire to labor? Hephaestus, from all accounts, genuinely loved Aphrodite. How could he not? She was literally the goddess of beauty and desire, and he had spent his entire existence being told he was ugly, being rejected for his appearance, being made to feel unworthy of love. Now he was married to the most beautiful being in creation. It must have seemed like vindication, like final proof that he had overcome his rejection, like Zeus was telling him that despite his appearance, despite his disability, he deserved the same prize that the beautiful gods competed for. He crafted gifts for her, of course. It was his love language, his way of expressing feelings he couldn't articulate verbally. He made her the famous girdle, that belt woven with magic that made its wearer irresistibly attractive. Ancient sources don't say whether Aphrodite ever wore it, but the symbolism is heartbreaking. Hephaestus creating an object to make his wife more beautiful, as if she needed enhancement, as if his gift could somehow make her desire him by increasing the very quality, beauty, that he lacked and she possessed in excess. He was trying to give her something valuable, but he was also acknowledging the gulf between them, admitting that he couldn't compete with other gods on their terms, only offer his skill as a substitute for physical attractiveness. He made her jewelry, necklaces, rings, crowns of such exquisite craftsmanship that they made even Aphrodite's natural beauty more striking. He crafted personal items for her comfort. He designed and built her palace with the same care he brought to all his work. He tried, in his way, to be a good husband, to show his love through his actions and creations, even if he couldn't show it through the beauty and desire she valued. But Aphrodite did not love Hephaestus, could not love him, had no desire for him, resented being married to him. For a goddess whose entire identity revolved around beauty, desire, sexual attraction, and the power of appearance, being bound to the ugliest god in Olympus was humiliating. She had not chosen this marriage. She did not want this husband. She looked at Hephaestus and saw only what everyone saw: the limp, the rough appearance, the soot-marked skin, the thick body built for labor rather than love. She saw a god who spent his time at a forge rather than at festivals, who valued creation over pleasure, who seemed to embody everything opposite to her nature. Their marriage was loveless from Aphrodite's side, not hateful necessarily, but empty, unfulfilling, a binding she chafed against. When Hephaestus touched her, did she flinch? When he tried to show affection, did she tolerate it politely? while wishing he would stop. Ancient sources don't give us intimate details, but they make clear that Aphrodite never desired her husband, never found him attractive, never felt the passion for him that was her defining characteristic toward others. So Aphrodite looked elsewhere for what she couldn't find in her marriage. She took lovers, many lovers, gods, heroes, mortals. Aphrodite's affairs were legendary and numerous. She slept with Hermes, with Dionysus, with Poseidon, with the mortal hero Anchises, becoming mother of Aeneas, with the beautiful youth Adonis, whom she loved with tragic intensity. Her infidelities were constant, open, shameless by conventional moral standards, though they were seen as somehow appropriate for the goddess of love and sexuality, whose very nature was to spread desire wherever she went. But her most significant, most sustained, most notorious affair was with Ares, god of war, and significantly, Hephaestus' rival, opposite and enemy. Where Hephaestus was ugly, Ares was handsome. Where Hephaestus was lame, Ares was powerfully athletic. Where Hephaestus created things, Ares destroyed them. Where Hephaestus was patient and calculating, Ares was impulsive and violent. They represented competing models of masculinity, and Aphrodite's choice between them was a judgment. She preferred the handsome warrior to the ugly craftsman, the beautiful destroyer to the functional creator. The affair with Ares was ongoing, sustained, not just a moment of weakness, but a real relationship. They had genuine passion for each other, genuine desire. When Hephaestus was at his forge, working through the night, Aphrodite was in Ares' bed. When Hephaestus was fulfilling commissions for other gods, Aphrodite was meeting her lover in secret places. When Hephaestus presented his wife with another beautiful gift, demonstrating his love through craft, she was thinking about Ares' strong arms, Ares' handsome face, Ares' passionate energy. Hephaestus knew, of course he knew, in some versions, Helios, the sun god, who sees everything that happens in daylight, specifically came to Hephaestus to inform him of his wife's adultery, describing in humiliating detail what Aphrodite and Ares did together. But Hephaestus probably knew even before Helios told him. He wasn't stupid, wasn't blind to his wife's behavior, couldn't have missed the way she looked at Ares compared to how she looked at him. The knowledge must have been agonizing. He had been told his entire existence that he was ugly, unworthy of love because of his appearance. He had fought against that judgment, proved his worth through skill, earned his place on Olympus, won the most beautiful wife in creation. And she was proving his early rejection correct. Yes, he was unlovable because of his appearance. Yes, beauty mattered more than skill. Yes, the handsome Ares, whom everyone could see was physically perfect, was more desirable than the ugly Hephaestus, whose genius was invisible until it created something. His wife's constant infidelity was a form of ongoing rejection, a daily reminder that he wasn't enough, could never be enough. That Zeus's gift of the beautiful wife had actually been a curse, binding him to someone who would never want him. Why did Hephaestus stay married to Aphrodite? Why not divorce her, especially given that Greek culture allowed divorce relatively easily? Several reasons seem possible. Pride. Divorcing would be admitting defeat, admitting that he wasn't man enough to keep his wife, proving to all Olympus that the match had been as impossible as everyone had known from the start. Hope. Perhaps he kept believing she might change, might come to value what he offered, might learn to love him. Fear, divorcing the goddess of love, might make him even more of a laughingstock than staying married to her infidelity. Or perhaps simply pain. Maybe leaving her would hurt more than staying did. Maybe having her as a wife who didn't want him was still better than acknowledging he couldn't have her at all, whatever his reasons. Hephaestus remained married to Aphrodite while knowing she took lover after lover, while hearing the other gods whisper about his cuckoldry, while watching Ares move through Olympus, knowing that warriors shared Hephaestus's wife's bed. The marriage was his daily humiliation, the proof that skill and genius couldn't overcome the power of beauty, that creating the most magnificent objects in existence still left him unable to create desire in his own wife. But Hephaestus was not a god who accepted humiliation passively. He had already demonstrated with the golden throne that his revenges were patient, calculated, and absolutely effective. He had proven that intelligence triumphs over power when intelligence has time to plan. And now, with his wife's affair, with Ares ongoing and increasingly public, Hephaestus began to plan his most famous revenge, one that would expose the lovers' shame before all Olympus, turn their passion into public spectacle, and demonstrate once again that the ugly god's cleverness made him more dangerous than all the beautiful god's strength. The golden throne had been revenge against his mother. The golden net would be revenge against his wife. And the trap he built would be as elegant, as inescapable, and as humiliating as the first. The golden net, the most famous revenge. When Helios came to Hephaestus and confirmed what the smith god had already suspected, that Aphrodite was conducting an ongoing affair with Ares, that his wife and his rival were betraying him together, that his marriage was a joke the entire divine court was aware of, Hephaestus's response was not immediate violence or public confrontation. He didn't storm into Aphrodite's chambers making accusations. He didn't challenge Ares to combat. He did what he always did when confronted with a problem. He went to his forge and built something. The golden net would become as famous as the golden throne. Another masterwork of craftsmanship turned into a weapon. Another example of how Hephaestus's intelligence and skill made him more dangerous than gods, with more conventional power. He designed this trap with the same meticulous care he brought to every creation, but this time the aesthetic beauty of the work was entirely secondary to its function. The net needed to be invisible, unbreakable, and capable of catching two immortal gods in the act of adultery. Hephaestus worked with gold again, but gold so fine, so delicate, so perfectly wrought that it was nearly transparent. Threads thinner than spider silk, but stronger than adamantine chains, woven into a net pattern with knots and joints so cunningly placed that, once triggered, it would be impossible to escape. Ancient sources describe the net as lighter than cobwebs, but strong enough to hold gods. A seeming paradox that only Hephaestus's supreme skill could achieve. The net would be invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it, even in bright light. It would drape across the bed, suspended from invisible supports, ready to drop at Hephaestus's command. He built the mechanism with the same attention to detail he'd given the throne's hidden springs. The trigger would be weight on the bed, specifically the weight of two bodies rather than one. The release would snap the net down around whoever was caught, wrapping them in unbreakable bonds, holding them in whatever position they occupied at the moment of capture. There would be no escape, no way to break free, no possibility of denying what they had been doing, because the net would preserve them in flagrante delicto, caught in the physical act itself. Once the net was complete and installed above the marital bed he shared with Aphrodite, Hephaestus prepared the second part of his plan. He announced publicly to Olympus that he would be traveling to Lemnos to visit his forge and workshops there, that he would be gone for several days, that he had various commissions to fulfill and business to conduct. He made sure everyone heard this announcement, especially making sure that Ares knew the smith god would be away from Olympus, that Aphrodite would be alone, unguarded, available. Then Hephaestus left Olympus with a great fanfare, taking his time, making sure he was seen, departing, traveling obviously toward Lemnos. But he didn't complete the journey. Once out of sight of Olympus, he circled back, hiding himself, waiting for the trap to spring. This was his genius again. Not just building the physical trap, but orchestrating the entire situation, manipulating his targets into doing exactly what he wanted when he wanted it. Ares, beautiful and stupid, saw exactly what he wanted to see. Hephaestus gone, Aphrodite available, an opportunity for uninterrupted time with his lover. He went to Aphrodite immediately, and she welcomed him without suspicion. They had done this countless times before, always when Hephaestus was occupied elsewhere, always believing themselves safe from discovery. They entered the bedchamber where Hephaestus and Aphrodite technically shared a marriage bed, a final insult to the cuckolded husband. The lovers using his own bed for their affair. Ancient sources tell us that Ares had even posted a guard named Electryon at the door, a youth whose job was to watch for Helios and warn Ares when dawn approached, when the sun god might see them. But on this day, exhausted by his vigil, Electryon fell asleep. Not that it mattered. Hephaestus wasn't relying on being seen. He was relying on mechanics, on the trap he had built, on the inevitability of weight-triggering release. Aphrodite and Ares climbed into bed together, lost in desire and passion, completely unaware of the golden net suspended invisibly above them. They embraced, began making love, their combined weight on the mattress activating Hephaestus's mechanism. The net fell, silent and sudden, dropping over them like a fisher's net over fish, wrapping around their naked bodies, binding them together in their intimate embrace. They tried to move and found they couldn't. The net tightened around them, holding them locked in position, trapped in the physical act of adultery, unable to separate or cover themselves or assume any kind of dignity. Aphrodite and Ares were caught, the goddess of love and the god of war. The most beautiful goddess and the handsomest god were bound together naked in a net they couldn't break, couldn't escape, couldn't even move within. Their passion had become imprisonment, their secret exposed, their shame immobilized and preserved. And then Hephaestus returned. He came back to Olympus, not secretly, but publicly, not quietly, but making noise, alerting everyone. He burst into his bedchamber, where Aphrodite and Ares lay trapped, and he didn't suffer in private humiliation. Instead, he summoned every god on Olympus to come witness what he had caught, to see the proof of his wife's adultery, to observe the god who had betrayed him, helpless in his trap. The gods came. All the male gods of Olympus crowded into Hephaestus's bedchamber, to see the spectacle he had created. Zeus, Poseidon, Apollo, Hermes, Dionysus, all of them gathering to witness Aphrodite and Ares naked and bound in the golden net, caught in the most compromising possible position, unable to move or hide or deny what they had been doing. The goddesses, according to Homer, stayed away out of embarrassment, not wanting to witness Aphrodite's humiliation, but the male gods had no such scruples. Hephaestus stood before them and proclaimed his grievance. He had been betrayed. His wife, whom Zeus had given him, had committed adultery with Ares. Here was proof, absolute, undeniable, caught in a net Hephaestus himself had forged. He demanded justice, demanded that Zeus return the bride price that had been paid, demanded that Aphrodite and Ares be punished for their transgression. The gods' response revealed much about divine morality, and the complicated place Hephaestus occupied, even in his triumph. Some gods were shocked, appropriately horrified by the betrayal. Some sympathized with Hephaestus's pain, acknowledged that he had been wronged, agreed that his wife and her lover should face consequences. But others, and this is the detail that makes the story so psychologically complex, others laughed. The assembled gods looked at beautiful Aphrodite and handsome Ares caught naked together, and they made jokes. Apollo and Hermes, according to Homer, had a conversation that ancient audiences found hilarious, but that reads as cruel to modern sensibilities. Apollo asked Hermes if he would be willing to be caught in such a net, publicly shamed like Ares was being shamed, if it meant sleeping with Aphrodite. Hermes answered enthusiastically yes, saying he would willingly be bound in 3 times as many nets, have all the gods and goddesses watching, if it meant he could be with Aphrodite. The implication was clear. Even the shame was worth it to sleep with someone so beautiful. Ares's humiliation was justified by Aphrodite's desirability. This response must have cut Hephaestus deeply, even in his moment of revenge, even when exposing his wife's betrayal and his rival's treachery. The other gods were essentially saying that Ares had made the right choice, that Aphrodite was so beautiful that adultery with her was worth any cost, that even being trapped and publicly shamed was a price worth paying for one night with her. They weren't sympathizing with Hephaestus's pain. They were envying Ares's opportunity. The underlying message was devastating. Of course Aphrodite cheated on you. Look at her. Look at Ares. Look at you. What did you expect? Hephaestus had proven he was the smartest god in Olympus, had demonstrated his superiority in craft and planning, had shown that he could trap and humiliate the mighty Ares, who had tried to forcibly retrieve him when he was in exile. But he couldn't make himself desirable. He couldn't make Aphrodite want him. He couldn't make the other gods see him as anything other than the ugly god, whose beautiful wife naturally looked elsewhere for passion. Poseidon, perhaps less insensitive than Apollo and Hermes, eventually intervened. He came to Hephaestus and asked him to release the captives. Poseidon offered to serve as guarantor, promising that Ares would pay whatever penalty was appropriate, that justice would be served. If Hephaestus released them now, before this humiliation destroyed both Aphrodite and Ares completely, Poseidon would ensure Ares made amends. Hephaestus, after making his point, after forcing all Olympus to witness his wife's betrayal and his rival's capture, agreed. He released the net. Aphrodite and Ares sprang apart immediately, deeply ashamed. unable to look at each other or anyone else. Ares fled to Thrace, his homeland, hiding from the shame of having been caught and exposed. Aphrodite fled to Cyprus, to her sacred precinct at Paphos, where she bathed in sacred waters and was attended by the Graces, trying to wash away the humiliation, restore her dignity, recover from being displayed as an adulteress before all the gods. The aftermath of the Golden Net incident varied in different sources. Some claimed Hephaestus and Aphrodite divorced after this, that the public exposure finally ended their doomed marriage, freeing both of them from a union neither had wanted. Hephaestus supposedly later married Aglaia, one of the Graces, and found genuine happiness with a goddess who valued his skill and appreciated his character rather than being repulsed by his appearance. Aphrodite eventually returned to Ares, their passion surviving the shame, and they would have several children together: Phobos, fear; Deimos, terror; Harmonia, harmony; and in some sources, Eros himself, the god of desire. Other sources suggest Aphrodite and Hephaestus remained married, continuing their loveless arrangement because Zeus had decreed it, and divine marriages were not easily dissolved. In these versions, the Golden Net incident became just one incident in an ongoing unhappy marriage, a moment of revenge and public humiliation that changed nothing fundamental about their relationship. Either way, the Golden Net had served its purpose. Hephaestus had exposed his wife's adultery publicly, had caught Ares in an inescapable trap, had demonstrated once again that cleverness defeats strength, that planning beats passion, that the smith god's mind was more powerful than the war god's muscles. He had humiliated his rivals, proven his point, shown all Olympus that he could not be crossed without consequences, even if he could not make himself loved. But had he actually achieved satisfaction? Had the revenge healed his pain? Aphrodite still didn't desire him. Ares was still more handsome. The gods still made jokes that revealed they saw his wife's infidelity as inevitable, understandable, even enviable. Hephaestus had won, had proven his superiority in craft and cunning, but he had lost the one thing he actually wanted: a wife who loved him. The Golden Net was a perfect trap, a brilliant revenge, a legendary example of divine justice. But it was also the action of a deeply wounded god who could humiliate his enemies but couldn't heal his own heart. Still, the Golden Net joined the Golden Throne in Hephaestus's legacy as a craftsman who turned rejection and pain into weapons of elegant, inescapable revenge. He had proven twice now that the ugly god was not powerless, that appearance didn't determine worth, that intelligence and skill were their own forms of divine power. Those who wronged him would pay, not through violence, but through being trapped in situations they couldn't escape, bound by nets and thrones and chains, forged by the god they had underestimated. Other revenges and notable myths, the Golden Throne and Golden Net, stand as Hephaestus's most famous revenges, but they were not his only acts of calculated retribution or his sole appearances in important myths. Throughout Greek mythology, Hephaestus appeared in various stories that revealed different aspects of his character, his powers, and his complicated relationships with gods and mortals. Some of these were revenges, some were moments where his skill served others' vengeance, and some showed how even in helping, his creations carried consequences. One of Hephaestus's most significant creations was also an act of divine revenge. not his revenge, but Zeus's revenge against humanity, and by extension against Prometheus, when the Titan Prometheus stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, defying Zeus's order and empowering mortals with a technology that would lift them from primitive survival toward civilization. Zeus decided that both Prometheus and humanity needed to be punished. The punishment for Prometheus was straightforward: chains to bind him to a rock where an eagle would eat his liver daily, with the liver regenerating each night so the torture could continue eternally. For this task, Zeus called upon Hephaestus. The smith god forged adamantine chains, unbreakable metal that could hold even a titan. Then Hephaestus himself traveled to the Caucasus Mountains and drove those chains through Prometheus's flesh into the living rock. Ancient sources suggest Hephaestus performed this task reluctantly. He sympathized with Prometheus, felt kinship with another divine outcast, understood why Prometheus might want to help humanity by sharing fire, the very element that was Hephaestus's own domain. But sympathy didn't stop him from following Zeus's command, from using his skill to create suffering, from binding another rejected god who had tried to help others. The punishment for humanity required a different kind of creation, and here Hephaestus's role was even more directly involved. Zeus commanded him to create a woman from clay and water, to craft a being that would appear to be a blessing, but would actually be a curse. Hephaestus shaped her body with the same care he brought to creating armor or jewelry, giving her human form, beauty, voice, and strength. But she was designed as a trap, a Trojan horse in human form. Other gods added their contributions. Athena taught her weaving and housecraft. Aphrodite gave her grace and desire. Hermes gave her cunning and deceit. But it was Hephaestus who created the basic structure, who brought clay to life, who demonstrated that his craft could produce not just objects but beings, not just tools but people. They named her Pandora, meaning all gifted, and sent her to Earth with a jar, mistranslated as a box in later versions, containing all the evils that would now afflict humanity: disease, old age, toil, suffering, death. Pandora opened the jar, releasing these evils into the world, and humanity has suffered them ever since. Only hope remained trapped inside when she managed to close the lid. Hephaestus had created an artificial being, an early myth of constructed life, but he had created her specifically to harm humanity, to punish mortals for accepting Prometheus's gift of fire. His genius was being used for revenge again, this time at Zeus's command rather than for his own purposes. But the pattern remained. Hephaestus's creations carried consequences. His skill served vengeance. His hands built both beauty and suffering. Another myth involving Hephaestus and Athena revealed a different kind of complication in divine relationships. According to some sources, when Hephaestus secured his freedom from exile and his permanent place on Olympus, he made demands of Zeus. One version claims he demanded marriage to Athena, goddess of wisdom and craft, a partnership that would have made sense given their shared interests in skilled work and creation. Poseidon, still angry at Athena for beating him in the competition to be patron of Athens, encouraged this demand, hoping to see the virgin goddess forced into marriage. But Athena was committed to eternal virginity. One of the three great virgin goddesses, along with Artemis and Hestia, she absolutely refused marriage to anyone, even Hephaestus, even though she respected his skill. When Hephaestus tried to force the issue, when his desire for the only goddess who seemed to appreciate his intellect overcame his usual restraint. Athena fought him off. He pursued her, caught her, tried to rape her, but Athena struck him with her spear and escaped. His seed fell to the earth, specifically onto Gaia, the earth goddess herself. Gaia, impregnated by this spillage, gave birth to a child named Erichthonius, who was half human, half serpent, the mythical founder of Athens. Athena took responsibility for the child, raising him in secret, and Erichthonius eventually became a great king of Athens, establishing many of the city's institutions and traditions. But the story revealed Hephaestus' capacity for violence, his frustrated desire expressing itself in attempted assault, his pain at being constantly rejected, manifesting in trying to take by force what he couldn't win through persuasion. This myth sits uncomfortably with Hephaestus' usual characterization as patient and calculating rather than impulsively violent. Perhaps it represented a moment when his control broke, when the accumulated rejections and humiliations pushed him past his limits. Perhaps it was a later addition to the mythology, explaining Erichthonius' origin by connecting him to both Athens' patron goddess and the god of craft, who was also important to the city. Either way, it showed that Hephaestus, for all his intelligence and skill, was also a god who had been deeply wounded, who carried rage and frustrated desire, who could be dangerous when pushed too far. Hephaestus' revenge extended even to his own daughter Harmonia, child of Aphrodite and Ares. When Harmonia married Cadmus, founder of Thebes, Hephaestus gave her a wedding gift, a magnificent necklace beautifully crafted, worthy of a goddess. But the necklace carried a curse. Anyone who wore it would bring tragedy to themselves and their descendants. The curse was Hephaestus' ongoing revenge against Aphrodite and Ares for their adultery, a punishment that would extend through generations. Harmonia and Cadmus were eventually transformed into serpents. Their daughter Semele, wearing the necklace, was killed when she asked Zeus to show himself in his true form and was consumed by his divine fire. The necklace passed through generations of Harmonia's descendants, bringing misfortune to each owner, culminating eventually in the tragedies that befell Oedipus and his family. One of the most famous tragic cycles in Greek mythology, Oedipus's discovery of his incestuous marriage, Jocasta's suicide, the mutual killing of Eteocles and Polynices, Antigone's defiance and death, all stemmed partly from the curse Hephaestus had woven into a necklace as revenge for his wife's infidelity. This reveals something disturbing about Hephaestus' capacity for revenge. It was patient, extending across generations, willing to harm innocents to hurt the guilty. Harmonia had impersonally wronged him. She was born from her parents' adultery, victim of circumstances rather than perpetrator of crimes. But Hephaestus punished her anyway, used her as a tool to hurt Aphrodite and Ares, demonstrated that his revenges weren't always precisely targeted, that collateral damage was acceptable if it ensured his enemies suffered. During the Trojan War, Hephaestus intervened directly in combat, not fighting personally but using his element, fire, as a weapon. When the river god's commander tried to drown Achilles, flooding his waters to overwhelm the Greek hero, Hera called on her son to intervene. Hephaestus unleashed fire on the river, boiling Scamander's waters, burning the bodies of dead warriors that clogged the stream, evaporating the flood, forcing the river god to retreat and beg for mercy. It was a display of raw elemental power, showing that the smith god could wield destruction as easily as creation, that fire was both his tool for crafting and his weapon for war. Hephaestus also had children beyond the circumstances of Erichthonius, though ancient sources disagree about many details. With various nymphs and goddesses, he fathered the Cabiri, mysterious metalworking deities worshipped on Lemnos and Samothrace, the Palati, twin gods of geysers in Sicily, and various other offspring associated with crafts, metalwork, and volcanic activity. These children carried on his work, his association with the fire and forge, his domain of transformation through heat and skill. Throughout all these myths, certain patterns emerge about Hephaestus's character. He served other gods' needs, creating weapons and tools for whoever commissioned them, rarely refusing requests even when they would cause harm. He was not independently moral in his craft. He made what was asked of him, whether it was chains to bind titans or women designed to curse humanity. His genius was available to be directed, his skill employed for purposes he didn't always control. But when it came to his own revenges, when he acted from personal grievance rather than divine commission, Hephaestus was patient, calculating, and absolutely thorough. He didn't strike in anger, but planned in cold fury. He designed traps that couldn't be escaped, created situations his enemies couldn't resolve without acknowledging him, demonstrated repeatedly that underestimating the ugly god was the most dangerous mistake the beautiful gods could make. His revenges also carried a consistent theme, forcing recognition. The Golden Throne trapped Hera until she acknowledged the son she'd rejected. The Golden Net exposed Aphrodite and Ares' adultery publicly, ensuring everyone knew what they had done. The Cursed Necklace ensured that generations would know about and suffer from Aphrodite and Ares' betrayal. Hephaestus didn't just want his enemies to suffer. He wanted everyone to see them suffering, wanted their shame to be public, wanted the world to understand that he had been wronged and had made his wrongdoers pay. This need for public vindication makes sense for a god who had been publicly rejected, whose entire existence on Olympus involved public awareness of his difference, his disability, his failure to meet divine aesthetic standards. If his humiliation was public, then his revenge needed to be public too. If everyone had seen him thrown from Olympus, everyone needed to see his mother trapped. If everyone knew his wife cheated on him, everyone needed to see her caught. Hephaestus's revenges were theater as much as justice, performances designed to reshape narratives, to transform himself from victim into victor, to prove that the god everyone pitied and mocked was actually the most dangerous god to cross, and that danger came not from strength or magic or authority, but from simple, patient intelligence applied through matchless craft, the ability to build things that worked exactly as intended, every time, inevitably. Fire, forges, and volcanic power Hephaestus was fundamentally the god of fire, not the celestial fire of Zeus's thunderbolts, not the sacrificial fire of altars and temples, not the domestic fire of the hearth, but the transformative fire of the forge, the volcanic fire that comes from deep within the earth, the fire that destroys to create, that melts in order to shape, that consumes materials to produce artifacts. Understanding Hephaestus means understanding his relationship with this element and how fire embodied both his power and his mythology. The ancient Greeks understood fire as one of the four fundamental elements, along with earth, air, and water. But fire was unique among these elements. It was transformative, both creative and destructive, capable of changing other materials' fundamental natures. Fire could purify metal or reduce cities to ash, could provide warmth in cooking or consume everything it touched. Fire was civilization itself. Humans without fire were barely different from animals, but humans with fire could forge metal, fire, clay into pottery, cook food, work through darkness, survive in harsh climates. Hephaestus's domain over fire was specifically technological fire. Human-used fire. Fire as a tool rather than a natural force. This distinguished him from Prometheus, who stole fire and gave it to humanity, and from Hestia, goddess of the hearthfire. Hephaestus represented what you could do with fire once you had it, the crafts and technologies that fire enabled, the transformation of raw materials into useful objects, the entire basis of human technological civilization. His association with volcanic fire made mythological sense and gave ancient Greeks a way to understand and explain volcanic activity. When Mount Etna erupted, spewing lava and smoke, the Greeks said Hephaestus was working in his forge beneath the mountain. When earthquakes shook volcanic regions, they were the pounding of his hammer on divine anvils. When gas vents issued sulfurous smoke, they were the chimneys of his workshops. Every volcano in the Greek world, Etna in Sicily, the volcanic islands like Lemnos and the Lipari chain, even distant volcanoes that Greek travelers reported, were understood as Hephaestus's forges, places where the earth itself breathed fire because the god was working beneath. This association had practical wisdom underlying it. Volcanic regions offered certain advantages for metalworking, ready access to heat, mineral-rich soil that often contained ore deposits, and volcanic materials that could be useful in various crafts. The island of Lemnos, sacred to Hephaestus, had volcanic activity and was known for Lemnian earth, a special clay with supposed healing properties. Sicily, where Mount Etna dominated, was rich in metals and had a strong tradition of metalworking and craftsmanship. Hephaestus's mythological presence in these locations reflected and reinforced their actual importance as centers of ancient industry. The Cyclopes, often depicted as Hephaestus's assistants, were associated with volcanoes and represented the raw, primal aspect of volcanic forge work. These one-eyed giants were master smiths in their own right, having forged Zeus's thunderbolts during the war against the Titans. Under Hephaestus's direction, they worked the divine forges, creating weapons and armor for gods and heroes. Ancient sources located their workshops in the depths of volcanic mountains, describing vast caverns filled with molten metal, titanic anvils, and forges that burned with heat drawn directly from the Earth's core. The connection between Hephaestus and volcanoes gave him a dual nature. He was simultaneously the civilized god of craft and technology, and the wild god of volcanic destruction. He could use fire to create the most delicate jewelry, or unleash it to boil rivers and burn armies. He represented fire's fundamental duality, the tool that made civilization possible, and the force that could destroy everything humans built. Hephaestus's worship reflected this connection to fire and craft. His main cult centers were Athens, where craftsmen honored him as patron, and Lemnos, the volcanic island where tradition said he had recovered from his fall. In Athens, the Hephaestus, later known as the Thessaion, still stands today, one of the best preserved ancient Greek temples, built in the mid-5th century BCE on a hill that's overlooking the Athenian Agora. It served both Hephaestus and Athena as joint patrons of craft. The temple's location near workshops, forges, and pottery studios reflected Hephaestus's role as protector of artisans and craftsmen. The Chalcea festival, celebrated in October in Athens, honored both Hephaestus and Athena. Workers in metal and other crafts would make offerings, display their finest work, and celebrate the gods who blessed their trades. This wasn't a major festival like the Panathenaea or the Dionysia. It didn't attract international visitors or involve great public spectacles, but it was important to the people who actually built Greek civilization, the craftsmen whose skilled labor produced the weapons, tools, armor, pottery, and countless other objects that made Greek culture possible. The Hephaestia, celebrated especially on Lemnos, involved torch races and fire rituals that honored Hephaestus's connection to flame. Participants would run carrying torches, passing sacred fire from person to person, celebrating fire as gift, tool, and divine presence. This torch race tradition appeared in various Greek festivals, often associated with Prometheus's theft of fire. But in Hephaestus's cult, it honored the god who taught humanity how to use fire once they had it, who revealed the secrets of the forge, who showed that fire could be controlled and directed, rather than simply feared or worshipped. The Romans inherited Hephaestus as Vulcan, and his worship took on additional significance in Roman culture. The Volcano, Vulcan's oldest temple in Rome, stood near the Forum, and his festival, the Vulcanalia, was celebrated in August during the hottest, driest, most fire-dangerous time of year. Romans would throw small fish and animals into fires as offerings, attempting to appease Vulcan's potentially destructive power, to turn his attention away from their wooden buildings and toward a controlled sacrifice. The festival acknowledged fire's danger. Rome burned multiple times in its history, devastating fires that destroyed huge portions of the city, and sought divine protection from the god who controlled flame. Vulcan's association with volcanic fire was reinforced by Roman experience. Mount Vesuvius, one of history's most famous volcanoes, exploded in 79 CE, destroying Pompeii and Herculaneum. Romans understood this as Vulcan's work, the fire god's workshop beneath the mountain erupting catastrophically. The word volcano itself comes from Vulcan's name, a linguistic legacy showing how the god's mythology became the standard explanation for these geological phenomena. Throughout antiquity, Hephaestus Vulcan represented the human relationship with fire. He was the god who proved that fire could be harnessed, that its destructive power could be turned to creative purposes, that the same element that burned forests could forge plowshares. He taught that technology required both respect for danger and willingness to work with dangerous forces, that creation often required destruction, melting ore to extract metal, burning fuel to generate heat, that progress came through transforming raw materials into something more useful. His iconography consistently emphasized his forge identity. In sculpture and vase painting, Hephaestus appears with hammer, tongs, and anvil, his clothes simple and practical, his body marked by work rather than adorned for display. He's often shown at his anvil, mid-swing with his hammer, crafting something. Sometimes he's depicted with his golden handmaidens, or with the Cyclopes assisting him. Always fire is present. The forge fire, volcanic fire, the element that defines his power and enables his craft. The sacred fire of Hephaestus' forge was understood as eternal, never fully extinguished, always ready to be coaxed back to full heat when work needed to be done. This eternal fire symbolized both the permanence of craft traditions, skills passed from master to apprentice across generations, never lost, always available, and the unending nature of technological work. There was always something new to create, something broken to repair, some commission to fulfill. Hephaestus' fire was also philosophically significant in Greek thought. The Stoics would later develop the concept of pneuma, divine fire or creative breath that animated all existence, and they connected this to Hephaestus as the god whose fire transformed dead matter into useful objects. The Neoplatonists saw fire as symbolic of the demiurge's creative power, the cosmic craftsman shaping raw chaos into ordered cosmos, and recognized Hephaestus as the mythological representation of this philosophical principle. In Hephaestus' forge, fire was servant and master simultaneously. It enabled everything he created, but demanded constant attention, constant feeding, constant respect for its power to destroy as easily as it helped create. This balanced relationship with fire, using it without being consumed by it, controlling it without extinguishing it, respecting its danger while exploiting its utility, represented the ideal relationship between humans and technology, between civilization and the powerful forces it harnessed. Hephaestus proved that the god who controlled fire, who understood its secrets, who could direct its transformative power, possessed a power as fundamental as Zeus's lightning or Poseidon's seas. Fire was civilization itself, and the god of fire was the god of human technological progress, of everything that separated humans from animals, of the entire basis of material culture. In his forge, surrounded by flame, Hephaestus demonstrated that the ugly god with the lame leg possessed the most important divine domain of all, the power to transform the world through craft, to build civilization through skilled labor, to prove that intelligence applied through technology was divine power made manifest. The wounded creator, legacy, and modern resonance. Hephaestus' story has resonated across millennia because it addresses themes that transcend any particular culture or era: disability and difference, rejection and resilience, the relationship between appearance and worth, the dignity of labor, and the power of creativity born from pain. In ancient Greece and Rome, in medieval and Renaissance Europe, and in modern popular culture, Hephaestus has served as a symbol, a cautionary tale, an inspiration, and a lens through which to examine our assumptions about beauty, ability, and value. In ancient Greek culture, Hephaestus represented something psychologically and socially important. He was the god who proved that disability didn't preclude achievement, that physical imperfection didn't mean worthlessness, that being different from the norm didn't mean being without value. For a culture deeply invested in the physical ideal, in the belief that kaloi kagathoi, beautiful and good, were the same thing, Hephaestus offered a challenging counterexample. He was ugly and lame, but also brilliant and essential. He couldn't walk properly, but could create things that even perfect gods couldn't make. Parents of disabled children could point to Hephaestus and find hope that their children might achieve great things despite physical challenges. Craftsmen could find dignity in a god who valued skill over beauty, who honored labor, who proved that working with your hands was a divine calling. Anyone who had ever felt rejected for not meeting aesthetic standards, who had been told they weren't good enough because of appearance, who had experienced the pain of being excluded from the realm of the beautiful, could find in Hephaestus a patron who understood that pain and had transformed it into power. But Hephaestus's mythology also revealed the costs of disability and difference in a culture that valued perfection. He was mocked openly on Olympus, laughed at while serving nectar, accepted but never quite equal, needed but never truly respected by gods who valued beauty over brilliance. His wife didn't love him. His mother had thrown him away. Even when he achieved revenge, even when he demonstrated his superiority, the underlying prejudice remained. Of course, Aphrodite cheated on him. Look at him. What did he expect? This honest acknowledgement that skill and achievement don't always overcome prejudice. That being brilliant doesn't make people love you. That you can be indispensable and still be mocked, gave Hephaestus's mythology a painful realism. He was proof that disability could be overcome, but also that it could never be fully escaped. That difference always marked you, even when you achieved success. In Roman culture, Vulcan took on slightly different resonances. Romans valued practical skill and hard work more than Greeks' aesthetic obsessions, and Vulcan represented the dignity of labor in ways that appealed to Roman values. He was patron of workers, craftsmen, builders, the people who made Rome's military might and urban grandeur possible. His temples weren't the biggest or most important, but they were there, acknowledging that civilization required makers, that someone had to forge the swords and build the aqueducts and craft the tools that let Rome function. During the medieval period, Hephaestus, Vulcan, became somewhat sinister in Christian interpretation. His association with fire and the underworld, volcanic forges beneath the earth, led to connections with hell and demons. Medieval texts sometimes portrayed Vulcan as a figure of darkness, his forge a pre-Christian hell, his craftsmanship devilish rather than divine. This represented Christianity's complicated relationship with pagan gods. They were demoted from divine to demonic, from sacred to profane, from worshipful to fearful. But even as Vulcan was demonized, craftsmen continued to honor him informally. Blacksmiths and metalworkers recognized their patron regardless of church teachings, understanding that the traditions of craft extended back to pre-Christian times, and that the god of the forge had value regardless of theological interpretation. The persistence of Hephaestus Vulcan in folk tradition and workers' rituals testify to the enduring power of his symbolism. He represented something fundamental about human creativity and technological capability that transcended religious transitions. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical mythology, and Hephaestus Vulcan appeared frequently in art and literature. Painters depicted him at his forge, often in scenes showing his creation of weapons for gods and heroes, or his capture of Aphrodite and Ares. The story of the golden net was especially popular. It offered opportunities to paint beautiful nude gods in dramatic situations, combining mythological gravitas with titillating content. But Renaissance depictions also sometimes sentimentalized or romanticized Hephaestus. He became the industrious craftsman, the noble worker, sometimes even achieving a kind of nobility through his skill and endurance. This reflected Renaissance humanism's elevation of human creativity and artistic genius. Hephaestus as the ultimate artist-craftsman, whose creations were art and engineering combined, whose genius was expressed through material rather than paint or marble, but was genius nonetheless. Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution thinkers found Hephaestus relevant as a symbol of technological progress. He represented human capacity to transform nature through skill and tools, to harness physical forces, especially fire and heat, for productive purposes, to build civilization through applied intelligence. As human industry grew more complex and mechanized, as factories and forges became centers of economic power, Hephaestus seemed prescient. He was the god of industrialization, millennia before it happened, patron of the machine age before machines existed. But this interpretation also raised questions. Was Hephaestus's forge a positive model for human industry, or did it prefigure industrial exploitation? If the god of craft was also mocked, rejected, forced to prove his worth constantly, did that reflect something true about how industrial societies treated workers? Socialist and labor movement thinkers sometimes invoked Hephaestus as symbol of labor's dignity, but also its exploitation, the maker whose skill created everything, but who was never fully valued for that creation. In modern popular culture, Hephaestus appears in various adaptations of Greek mythology. Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series features a Hephaestus cabin at Camp Half-Blood, filled with mechanically gifted demigods who build weapons and gadgets. These children of Hephaestus are portrayed sympathetically, as clever and capable despite not being as flashy as children of more famous gods. The series emphasizes Hephaestus's core appeal. He's the god for kids who are good with their hands, who understand how things work, who might not be conventionally attractive or athletic, but who possess skills that make them invaluable. The video game Hades by Supergiant Games originally portrays Hephaestus using his Roman name Vulcan as part of Zagreus' extended divine family. Various other games, novels, comics, and television shows featuring Greek mythology include Hephaestus, usually emphasizing his role as divine blacksmith and his complicated relationships with Aphrodite and other Olympians. Modern disability studies and disability rights movements have found Hephaestus a compelling figure precisely because his mythology doesn't erase or resolve his disability. He remains lame throughout all his stories. His disability is permanent, unchanging, part of his identity. Yet he achieves great things, commands respect, even if grudgingly given, proves his worth. He represents neither inspiration porn, the disabled person who achieves something that makes able-bodied people feel inspired, nor tragedy porn, the disabled person whose story is only about suffering. He's simply a disabled god who does great work, experiences both success and rejection, loves and is hurt, revenges himself brilliantly, and remains disabled the entire time. Some modern interpretations read Hephaestus's outsider status and his retreat into intensive skilled work as potentially neurodivergent. His hyper-focus on craft, his preference for working alone or with mechanical assistance rather than with other gods, his difficulty with social situations, his marriage, his interactions with other Olympians, his brilliance in specific domains, combined with challenges in others. These characteristics resonate with autistic or otherwise neurodivergent experiences. Whether this reading would have made sense to ancient Greeks is questionable, but it demonstrates how Hephaestus's mythology can speak to various forms of difference, and the ways people who think differently navigate worlds not designed for them. Feminist scholars have examined Hephaestus's mythology through the lens of his marriages and relationships with goddesses. His marriage to Aphrodite represents the ultimate mismatch, but it also reveals assumptions about worth and desire. The beautiful woman forced to marry the ugly man as punishment. The man who believes he deserves the beautiful woman because he's achieved other forms of success. The wife who takes lovers because her husband can't satisfy her needs. Modern readers might see this as a critique of arranged marriage, of marriages based on everything except mutual attraction, of the assumption that men earn beautiful wives through achievement. His attempted rape of Athena is deeply troubling and has been discussed as reflecting toxic masculinity, or as demonstrating how even sympathetic male characters in mythology commit violence against women. The myth shows a man who believes he deserves a woman's sexual attention, who tries to take by force what wasn't freely given, who prioritizes his desire over her autonomy. That this man is otherwise portrayed sympathetically, rejected for disability, brilliant craftsman, victim of his wife's infidelity, doesn't excuse his violence, but does reflect the complicated ways mythology portrays characters with both sympathetic and reprehensible qualities. Hephaestus's core appeal in modern consciousness comes from his representation of the wounded healer or wounded creator archetype, the person whose pain and rejection become the source of their creative power, who transforms trauma into art or craft, who builds beauty from their own brokenness. This archetype appears across cultures and literatures, but Hephaestus is one of its oldest and clearest expressions. He was literally thrown away, and literally became the greatest creator in his cosmos. His rejection was the origin of his genius. His exile was where he learned his craft. This narrative resonates because many creative people do experience some version of this pattern, feeling different or excluded, finding solace and identity in creative work, using art or craft as a way to process pain and prove worth. The romantic image of the suffering artist, the tortured genius, the outcast who creates masterworks. Hephaestus embodies this thousands of years before the Romantic period formalized it as an archetype. But Hephaestus's mythology also complicates the wounded creator narrative by showing that trauma doesn't automatically lead to heroism, that brilliance doesn't heal pain, that success doesn't undo rejection. He achieves everything a god could want: permanent place on Olympus, a beautiful wife, recognition of his genius, the respect, however grudging, of other gods. But he's still hurt, still angry, still plotting revenges against those who wronged him. His pain doesn't make him noble, it makes him dangerous. His rejection doesn't purify him, it scars him permanently. His creativity is inseparable from his wounds, but the wounds don't close just because he creates beautiful things. The fire of Hephaestus's forge, transformative, dangerous, necessary, controlled, but never entirely safe, becomes a metaphor for the creative process itself. especially creativity born from trauma. You take raw, painful material and you heat it, hammer it, shape it into something else. The process is violent, the heat is dangerous, the outcome is uncertain. Sometimes you create beauty, sometimes you create weapons, sometimes you create traps disguised as gifts. But you're always working with fire, always at risk of being burned, always dancing the line between creation and destruction. In this sense, Hephaestus remains relevant because he represents truths about creativity, disability, difference, and resilience that transcend historical periods. He's the patron god of anyone who has ever felt rejected and channeled that rejection into achievement. He's the divine example for anyone who succeeds despite disadvantage, who makes themselves necessary through skill, who proves that appearance doesn't determine worth. He's the reminder that the hands that build things have power, that intelligence expressed through craft is its own form of divinity, that even the gods need someone to make their weapons and armor and palaces. But he's also the warning that revenge, however elegant and calculated, doesn't heal pain, that success doesn't automatically bring love, that being indispensable doesn't make you accepted, that you can win every battle and still lose the war for others' genuine affection and respect. Hephaestus gets his revenge on Hera, on Aphrodite, on Ares. But does he ever get what he actually wants? To be valued not just for his skill, but for himself. To be loved despite his appearance. To belong without having to constantly prove his worth. The ancient sources don't answer that question. Hephaestus remains on Olympus, working at his forge, creating magnificent objects, plotting occasional revenges, living with his limp and his scars and his genius. The fires never go out. The hammer never stops falling. The ugly god continues making beautiful things, continues transforming pain into power, continues proving that worth comes from what you create rather than how you look. And that, perhaps, is the point. Not that the wounded creator finds healing, but that creation itself is the response to being wounded. That the forge and the flame and the work are their own answer, their own form of divine existence. Conclusion. We have traveled through the forge fires of Hephaestus' story, from his traumatic birth and rejection, through his exile and return, from his magnificent creations to his calculated revenges, from his painful marriage to his enduring legacy. We have met the god who was thrown from Olympus as a child and climbed back through sheer brilliance, who transformed his mother's cruelty into a golden throne that trapped her, who answered his wife's infidelity with a net that exposed her shame, who proved repeatedly that intelligence and skill were forms of divine power as potent as beauty or strength. Hephaestus' story reminds us that worth is not determined by appearance, that disability does not preclude achievement, that rejection can be the forge in which genius is tempered. He stands as the god of everyone who has ever felt unwanted, who has channeled pain into creativity, who has made themselves indispensable through skill when they couldn't achieve acceptance through beauty. He is the wounded creator, the ugly god whose hands produced the most beautiful objects in existence, the outcast who became essential, the rejected child who forced recognition through undeniable mastery. But his mythology also teaches us darker truths, that revenge, however elegant, doesn't heal the wounds that inspired it. That being needed is not the same as being loved. that success and respect don't automatically bring acceptance or affection, that some pains never fully heal, some rejections leave scars that last lifetimes, some wounds continue bleeding beneath brilliant surfaces. Hephaestus won his revenges, but lost his marriage. He secured his place on Olympus, but remained the god the others laughed at. He created things of timeless beauty, but couldn't create desire in his wife's heart. He proved his worth countless times, but had to keep proving it over and over, because the world never quite stopped judging him by his appearance first, and his genius second. The forge fires still burn in every blacksmith shop, every craftsman's workshop, every artist's studio, every place where human hands transform raw materials into beautiful or useful objects. The spirit of Hephaestus endures. He teaches us that creation itself is an act of defiance, that making things is how we prove our existence matters, that the hands that build the world possess their own form of divine power. If you enjoyed this deep exploration into the brilliant, wounded, vengeful god of the forge, into the divine craftsman who turned rejection into revolution, and pain into the most magnificent creations Olympus ever knew, please like this video and subscribe to the Mythos Deep Dive. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our detailed journeys into Greek mythology's most complex and compelling figures. Share this with anyone fascinated by Greek gods, by the psychology of revenge, by stories of disability and resilience, by the timeless power of craft and creativity. Let us know in the comments which aspect of Hephaestus's mythology resonated most with you. His traumatic rejection and fall, his brilliant revenges, his painful marriage, his magnificent creations, or his enduring legacy as patron of craftsmen. Tell us about other gods or heroes you'd like us to explore in future videos. And remember that worth comes not from how we appear, but from what we create. That the hands that build things matter more than the faces that launch ships. That intelligence applied through patient skill can triumph over strength and beauty both. May your own forge fires burn bright. May your own creations bring you pride. And may you find, like Hephaestus, that even when the world rejects you, the work of your hands can make you indispensable.